Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I will be reviewing Dreamland by Nancy Bilyeau. This is a historical fiction novel that takes place in 1911. The main character, Peggy Batternberg, is the heiress of a very wealthy family who owns mines. At the beginning of the book, she's working at a bookstore not because she needs the money, but because she uses it as a means of independence to get away from her overbearing family, whom she doesn't really like that much, doesn't fit in with, and she suspects they don't really like her much either. All is going well until some members of her family barge into the bookstore and tell her that she can no longer work there and that she will be coming to spend the summer with them at the Oriental Hotel. Obviously this news does not please Peggy, but she goes along with her family to placate them because all of them, in fact, are going to the Oriental Hotel at the insistence of none other than Henry Taul, who is Peggy's sister Lydia's fiance. Henry Taul is extremely wealthy and would be a good match for her sister Lydia, and as it turns out, a good match for the family as well, because the Batternbergs are not as well off currently as they may seem. Peggy's father died and left a lot of debt for the rest of the family to deal with, and so they need Henry Taul's money, and the only way they can get it is if Lydia marries him. And so Peggy agrees to play nice and play along in the hopes that the marriage will take place. She can't really afford to offend Henry, and that is a very real possibility because she and Henry have a past, and so she does as Henry wishes and goes to the Oriental Hotel, which is right across from Coney Island. During their stay, various women are found dead nearby, and it's very clear that there's something suspicious and sinister going on underneath the surface. Peggy finds herself drawn to Coney Island's attractions, and while there, she meets and falls in love with a young artist named Stefan, who is from Serbia. And the two of them find themselves mixed up in this murder mystery and the whole question of who is behind the killing of these young women. I very much enjoyed this book. I learned a lot from it about Coney Island. I knew next to nothing about it except that I knew it existed, but I didn't know that there were actually 3 separate parks at the time. You had Steeplechase, which was the longest lived, Luna Park, which I had already read a book about, where there were incubators for premature babies, and then you had Dreamland, which was the shortest lived. This book was basically everything that I had hoped that the Night Circus would be, but never really was. I never finished reading the Night Circus because I didn't really enjoy it, and it never really materialized what I had hoped the story would be, but Dreamland had all of the atmospheric vibes that you'd want to go along with a circus or amusement park story. Not only did I learn a lot, I just really enjoyed immersing myself in this world, and it's crazy to think that all of this stuff really did exist in 1911. I looked up some pictures of some of the amusements and attractions that were mentioned in the book so that I would know what they really looked like, and there's not a lot of pictures that seem to exist of what the park did look like at the time, but there was enough to give you an idea. And it's just crazy that this existed back then, that they built this, and there was clearly craftsmanship that went into building this. It didn't really feel cheap, and I can't even imagine what it must have been like to walk among these places at the time, and just the sights and the smells, and to be completely enveloped in that world. Nowadays, it doesn't seem like amusement parks are all that special in comparison to what this must have been for people at the time. Then again, I have only been to one amusement park one time, and while I did enjoy it, that hardly makes me an expert, but it just feels different. It had a sort of different feeling at the beginning of the turn of the century, and there was something in that was lost, I think, when the whole thing shut down. Of course, you also have the murder mystery aspect of the story, and I thought that Peggy's relationship with Stefan was very sweet. Her dynamic between the family members was also very interesting. There was this sinister undertone to it when various things begin happening. There was one scene in particular when Peggy is in her hotel room alone and she falls asleep in the chair, and then she wakes up unsure of what time it is, and she looks up and happens to see that the doorknob is turning. Somebody is trying to get into her room, and just the imagery of that simple scene, that simple action, was very creepy to me because it's something that I can easily see happening in real life. There's very much this sinister undertone amidst the levity that is Coney Island. There were 2 things in this book, though, that didn't really work for me and did keep me from loving it. So while I did like it, I couldn't really love it as much as I had hoped that I would, or as much as I wanted to, because of these 2 things. And those are spoilers, so I will get into those now. But another thing that I want to mention first is also a spoiler, and that is what happens to Dreamland. Dreamland actually burned to the ground in 1911, and since this book takes place in 1911, when I read that, I fully expected it to be a part of the story, and it was, just not necessarily in the way that I thought, but yes, Dreamland burned to the ground. It was a complete and total loss, and it was never rebuilt. And part of the problem, part of why the fire was so bad and so destructive was because when Dreamland initially caught fire, the other parks panicked and began releasing, if I understood this correctly, I kind of picture like the automatic sprinklers that turn on in buildings when smoke is detected. I kind of picture that to be the sort of thing that happened. It's almost like they flooded or wetted their own amusements to try to prevent them from catching fire due to the close proximity. Regardless of how exactly this works, what happened was they lowered the water pressure to the point where water couldn't be delivered to Dreamland, which was actually on fire, and so it just burned to the ground. The fire eventually burned itself out completely. Miraculously, I do not believe that there was any loss of human life, but there was loss of animal life. Some of the animals that were there perished. In fact, in the book it makes mention that Little Hip, the elephant, died in the fire because he refused to be moved from his cage without his trainer present. So that's very sad. And it's sad that this was the end of this park. It was never rebuilt. There was never anything else like it out there, and the reason that it was never rebuilt was that Dreamland was not doing well financially. It splurged a lot on attractions to try to get people to come in, but they weren't drawing in as much money as their competitors, and so it just was never rebuilt. Another thing that is unfortunate that probably needs to be mentioned about Dreamland and probably other parts of Coney Island as a whole is that some of their attractions were kind of offensive, and they preyed on exoticism, so they brought in people from all over the world, basically so that they could be stared at. There were freak shows and things like that, and like the Lilliputian village, which was obviously not handled with the sensitivity that it would have been today, but at the same time, it's not surprising, given the time period that we're dealing with. But the two things about the book that held me back from loving it was Peggy's relationship with Stefan and the murder mystery as a whole. So, when Peggy and Stefan first meet, their relationship felt a little bit insta-love to me, and I can completely understand why people would think that it is. For me, I didn't really think that it was insta-love at the beginning because I could understand why these two individuals would be fascinated and drawn to each other. They come from completely different worlds, and under normal circumstances, their paths would never cross. Peggy comes from a wealthy family, Stefan is a poor painter and an immigrant, and completely the kind of person that her snobbish wealthy family would disapprove of. If she hadn't come to Coney Island, Peggy would probably have never met anyone like Stefan, so I understood the attraction that they felt toward each other and that magnetic sort of draw. Peggy also appreciated his artwork, and that's the initial connection that exists between the two characters. So I didn't initially feel that the relationship was insta-love. I just thought that this attraction that they naturally feel for each other would be the springboard to something more, that it would lead to a blossoming romance. But the problem is that the characters very soon profess their love for each other, and that's where it definitely felt insta-love for me. They barely know each other, and they certainly don't know each other well enough to say that this is love. Now, to its credit, I do think that this sort of plays out at the end. Stefan and Peggy don't end up together. The police end up suspecting Stefan falsely of the murders that are happening because he is a convenient suspect. Not only is he an immigrant, he's from Serbia, and Serbia has a reputation during this time for being known for anarchists, and there's the whole socialist worry and the brewing conflict in Europe that eventually explodes into World War I. So it makes sense why the police would latch onto him. He's a convenient suspect, but he is in fact innocent. Doesn't matter to the police though, they still harass him, they target him, and they beat him at some point as well. Peggy feels bad about this because she feels responsible. She's the one who encouraged Stefan to go with her to the police because she believed they might have information that is important to the murder investigation. The first night she and Stefan meet, they go for a walk on the beach and do a little bit more than just walk. They share a kiss or two, and while they're doing that, Stefan suddenly mentions to Peggy that there is a man who is watching them. He seems to have followed them, and then the very next morning it's revealed that a woman has been strangled to death not far from that place where they shared that kiss, and so that obviously freaks Peggy out, and she thinks that this man that Stefan saw might be important to the murder investigation. investigation. It's possible that Stefan saw the murderer, so she convinces him to go to her with the police despite Stefan's obvious reluctance and his dislike of the police due to the experiences that he's had with them in the past. So Peggy feels guilty over what happened with Stefan's interactions with the police because he never would have gone there in the first place if she hadn't asked him to accompany her. In the end, obviously, it's proven that Stefan is in fact innocent and he has nothing to do with these murders, but he decides to go back to his home country. He has family there who are currently trying to leave because conditions are not good and starvation is a problem, but in the end he decides he wants to go back to his home country and his family members because he believes that he can do some good there, and he's a bit disillusioned with America following his experiences with this whole police investigation. He doesn't really want to stay. Peggy is devastated by this, but she understands his decision and she does not beg him to stay because that would only result in her own humiliation and it wouldn't actually change his mind. So she lets him go, and we don't know what actually happened to him. There's a few sentences at the end of the book that signify maybe some things that happened later in Peggy's life and the kind of woman she becomes, and that was very interesting to read. And I have really no idea what she's talking about at the same time because we never get anything concrete about that time, and obviously there really isn't another story to this. But yes, I felt that their relationship did turn a bit insta-love, and like I said, it was too early for them to say that they loved each other. They didn't even really know each other that well, and the ending kind of proves that. So I want to give props to this book for having the guts to not give a happily ever after ending when it doesn't really fit. I feel like so many of the times when it comes to romance, a book will give the reader a happily ever after ending even when it's not realistic. But this book didn't do that, and so I appreciate that. The other thing about this book that kept me from loving it was the solution to the murder mystery itself. I honestly thought that there would be more investigation done on Peggy's part than there ultimately ended up being. So the murder mystery kind of took a backseat. It served more as the impetus for other things in the plot having happened, but it was less of a plot point itself. It was in the background for most of the book until Stefan is arrested and accused of the crime, and Peggy decides that the only way to prove that he is innocent is for her to find out who really killed these women. And so that's when the investigation really begins in earnest. Before that, it was just handled by the police. And while that's not a problem in and of itself, I suspected from the beginning that somebody in Peggy's family was the killer. There's this sinister vibe that surrounds them, as I said, and they're just a little off, they're a little eccentric, and you don't really know who you can trust, and none of them have decent alibis, and they're out at all hours of the night, so it's very just suspicious overall. But rather than one of her family members actually being the killer, it's revealed that the murderer is Henry Taul, Lydia's fiance. So he's not yet a member of the family. There was a subplot, I suppose, in the book where his mother is going with them to the Oriental Hotel, and it's kind of suggested that she's the one that actually demanded everybody else be there. And of course, because they want the marriage to go through, the Batternbergs agree to this. Regardless, it takes a long time for us as the reader to actually see Henry's mother, and I thought maybe she didn't actually exist and he had lied about that. But she does exist, and she knows what kind of person her son is, and she hasn't done anything to stop him. I'm not exactly sure why Henry carried out these murders. It's very heavily implied, if not proven, that he's on some sort of illicit drug, but that in and of itself doesn't really explain these murders. It's more like his servants were the real killers and they just got him involved in these illicit activities. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know what his real motive was, but he's just a kind of off. He's just strange. I don't understand his character really. And so I didn't find this solution to the crime to be all that satisfying. I'm not in the least bit surprised by it, but I do find it a little unsatisfying just because I'm not exactly sure what his motive was. The author states that Henry's character is based off of Harry Taul of Pittsburgh, and if you know anything about him, you can definitely see the resemblance almost immediately. I knew exactly who Harry Taul of Pittsburgh was because I read a book on him last year, and so I can see the resemblance. I know all about him. He's a piece of work. But what Harry Taul of Pittsburgh did in real life was not the same thing as what Henry Taul does in this book. So I found the murder mystery element to be a little lackluster compared to the hopes that I'd had for it, and so that compared with the insta-love nature of Stefan and Peggy's relationship, it kept me from loving this book as much as I wanted to. But I did quite enjoy it, especially the atmospheric side of things. I feel like up until the midpoint, the book is just absolutely fantastic, and the characters are interesting and suspicious. The atmosphere is wonderful with the world building and just the things that you learn about Coney Island and Dreamland as a whole. The later half of the book was a little bit less enjoyable for me, but it was still very good in my opinion, and I'm happy to have read it. I wouldn't read it again. Sadly, if I had loved it, I would have, and there was a part of the book where I thought I would be adding it to the shelf behind me, but sadly not. Even so, if you're interested in historical fiction, novels, or Coney Island, or amusement parks, this would be the perfect read for you. It's not perfect, it has some problems, but it was very enjoyable. I'm pleased that I picked it up, and I was surprised by how much I did end up liking it. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!